The Draconid sanctuary of Velthorax floated in the cold reaches of space, a crystalline structure that housed the galaxy's most tragic inhabitants, orphaned dragon hatchlings. The facility was a marvel of engineering, built by the Velcari Empire to preserve their most sacred creatures after the Crimson Plague had devastated their homeworld. But despite its technological sophistication, the sanctuary was failing. Albertchen stood at the observation deck, his breath fogging slightly in the frigid air. The human engineer had arrived 3 cycles ago, contracted by the Velcari after their own specialists had given up. He watched through the transparent aluminum as a cluster of young dragons huddled together in the central chamber, their scales dull and lifeless. "They are dying," said Katniss Velmora, the sanctuary's director. Her own scales, a deep sapphire blue, seemed to dim as she spoke. "Slowly, but inevitably. We provide them with optimal nutrition, perfect atmospheric conditions, and constant medical care. Yet they fade." Albert ran a hand through his dark hair, studying the diagnostic readouts on his tablet. "Your environmental systems are flawless," he admitted. "Temperature regulated to 0.01 degrees. Humidity controlled. Air composition perfect for Draconid physiology." "Then what?" Katniss's voice cracked with desperation. "Why do they not thrive?" The human engineer was quiet for a long moment, watching a small hatchling, barely the size of a house cat, attempt to curl closer to its companions. "Because you're giving them survival," he said finally. "Not life." Katniss's head snapped toward him, her golden eyes narrowing. "Explain." "On Earth, we learned something about orphaned animals centuries ago. You can provide perfect conditions, perfect nutrition, perfect medical care, and they'll still fail to thrive. Do you know what made the difference?" The Draconid director shook her head slowly. "Touch. Warmth. Not thermal regulation, emotional warmth. Connection." Albert pulled up files on his tablet, showing images from Earth's history. Human babies who aren't held, aren't touched, can literally die from the absence of physical affection. We called it failure to thrive. Your hatchlings are experiencing the same thing. "But we attend to them constantly," Katniss protested. "The medical staff checks them every hour. Clinical checks aren't the same as comfort," Albert interrupted gently. "They need more than efficiency. They need care that feels like love." Katniss stared at him as if he'd spoken in an alien tongue. The Velcari were a proud, ancient species, logical, precise, and deeply committed to their duties. But their culture had evolved beyond what they considered primitive emotional expressions. The very concept Albert described seemed illogical. "You're asking us to be inefficient?" she asked carefully. "I'm asking you to be alive." Over the next several days, Albert worked tirelessly, but not on the environmental systems or medical equipment. Instead, he retrofitted one of the smaller chambers, filling it with what the Velcari staff considered bizarre equipment. Soft materials that served no apparent function. Heating elements that operated inefficiently, creating pockets of warmth rather than even distribution. Strange curved structures that seemed to serve no purpose at all. "This is absurd," muttered one of the Velcari technicians as Albert installed what appeared to be a primitive textile fabricator. "Maybe," Albert said, not looking up from his work. "But let's try it anyway." When he finally opened the chamber to the hatchlings, Katniss watched with skeptical curiosity. Albert had created what he called a comfort nest, areas of varied temperature, soft fabrics that the young dragons could burrow into, and structures designed not for efficiency, but for the simple pleasure of exploration and rest. Then Albert did something that made every Velcari in the facility freeze in shock. He walked into the chamber, sat down on the soft flooring, and simply waited. A small hatchling, her scales a pale silver, approached cautiously. Albert remained still, his posture relaxed and non-threatening. The hatchling sniffed his hand, then, in a movement that made Katniss gasp, crawled directly into his lap. That Albert's hand came down gently on the hatchling's head, stroking slowly. The young dragon's scales began to shimmer, catching light they hadn't reflected in weeks. A soft, rumbling purr, a sound no one had heard in the sanctuary for months, emanated from the tiny creature. "Impossible," Katniss whispered, but it wasn't impossible. Within minutes, other hatchlings approached. Albert couldn't hold them all, but he touched each one, spoke to them in soft tones, and simply existed with them. Not as a technician performing a function, but as a living being offering connection. Over the following weeks, Albert trained the Valkyrie staff in what he called comfort protocols. Katniss was his most dedicated student, though the concept challenged everything she'd been taught about proper professional conduct. "It feels strange," she admitted one evening as she sat with 3 hatchlings curled against her. "Inefficient. I should be monitoring their vitals, checking their nutrition levels. You are doing something more important," Albert said, sitting nearby with 2 hatchlings of his own. "You're teaching them that they matter, not as genetic specimens to be preserved, but as individuals worthy of affection." Katniss looked down at the young dragons against her scales. One of them, the small silver one who'd first approached Albert, looked up at her with trusting eyes. Something shifted in Katniss's chest, an emotion she'd been trained to suppress but could no longer deny. "We thought we were saving them," she said quietly, "but we were just keeping them alive. There's a difference, isn't there?" "Yes," Albert replied. "A crucial one." The transformation of the sanctuary was remarkable. Within 2 cycles, every hatchling showed improvement. Their scales brightened, their appetites increased, and, most tellingly, they began to play. The staff, initially resistant to Albert's inefficient methods, found themselves forming genuine bonds with their charges. On his last day before returning to Earth, Albert stood once more at the observation deck. The central chamber was transformed, no longer a sterile medical facility but a living space filled with warmth, both literal and metaphorical. Hatchlings climbed on structures designed for joy rather than function. Staff members sat with young dragons, offering comfort and connection. Katniss approached, her scales now vibrant and healthy. In her arms, she carried the small silver hatchling, the first to trust. "She has bonded with me," Katniss said, wonder in her voice. "I will raise her as my own." Several staff members are doing the same. "Good," Albert smiled. "That's what they needed all along. Not just a sanctuary, a home. Not just caretakers, family." "We preserve their bodies," Katniss said, looking down at the hatchling with something that could only be called love. "But you showed us how to save their souls. How did humans learn this?" Albert's expression grew distant. "The hard way, through mistakes and losses. But eventually, we figured out that survival isn't enough. Not for us, and apparently not for dragons either. We all need warmth, the kind that comes from being genuinely cared for." As his transport prepared for departure, Albert took one last look at the sanctuary. The dragons would survive now, not because of perfect environmental controls or optimal nutrition schedules, but because they were loved. Sometimes, he reflected, the most advanced technology in the universe couldn't replace the oldest gift in existence, the simple warmth of genuine connection. Humanity had learned that lesson well. Now, in the cold reaches of space, it had shared that knowledge with dragons, and in doing so, had given them something far more valuable than survival. It had given them life.